What if I told you that in the final weeks of World War II, Adolf Hitler sent children as young as 12 to fight Soviet tanks with nothing but handheld rockets and fanatical belief? That while the Third Reich collapsed around them, boys who should have been in school were manning anti-aircraft guns, executing deserters, and dying by the thousands in the ruins of Berlin? Not as victims of the Nazi regime, but as some of its most fanatical defenders? This is the story of the Hitler Youth's last stand. The horrifying final chapter when Nazi indoctrination transformed an entire generation of children into soldiers, executioners, and fanatics willing to die for a Führer who saw them as expendable. And the darkest part, some of them volunteered. To understand how children became the Third Reich's final defenders, we must go back to 1933, the year Hitler came to power. One of the Nazi Party's first major initiatives was reorganizing and expanding the Hitler Youth, Hitlerjugend, transforming it from a small party organization into a mandatory state institution encompassing virtually every German child. The goal was comprehensive: to create a generation that knew nothing but Nazi ideology, that had been shaped from earliest childhood to serve the state without question, that valued loyalty above life itself. By 1936, all other youth organizations in Germany had been banned. If you were a German child, you joined the Hitler Youth, or you faced social ostracism, family pressure, and eventually legal consequences. Boys joined at age 10, though preparatory organizations began as young as 6. The program was designed as a complete replacement for traditional education, family values, and religious instruction. In Hitler Youth camps and meetings, children learned that loyalty to the Führer transcended loyalty to family. Death in service to the Reich was the highest honor. Individual life mattered less than the collective destiny of the German race. Jews, Slavs, and other inferior peoples were existential threats to be eliminated. Pacifism was weakness. Mercy was betrayal. Questioning was treason. The indoctrination was total and sophisticated. It wasn't just propaganda lectures, it was sports competitions designed to promote aggression, camping trips that practiced military maneuvers, songs that glorified death in battle, and constant reinforcement that dying for Hitler was the greatest achievement possible. One popular Hitler Youth song included the lyrics, "We are the future soldiers, we are the young battalion, we are born to die for Germany. Our death means nothing. Germany must live." Children sang this. They sang it enthusiastically. As the war dragged on and Germany's situation became desperate, the Hitler Youth's focus shifted from indoctrination to militarization. By 1943, teenage boys were being trained on anti-aircraft guns to defend German cities from Allied bombing raids. These weren't auxiliary roles. These were combat positions where 15 and 16-year-olds operated actual military weapons, were targeted by enemy aircraft, and died in significant numbers. By 1944, Hitler Youth units were being formed into formal military divisions. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, was composed primarily of 17-year-olds, stiffened by a corps of older SS veterans to provide combat experience. This division fought in Normandy after D-Day and became notorious for war crimes, including the massacre of Canadian prisoners at the Ardennes Abbey. The fanaticism of these teenage soldiers shocked even hardened Allied veterans, who reported that Hitler Youth members fought with suicidal aggression and almost never surrendered. But all of this was just preparation. The true test, the ultimate horror, would come in the final months of the war, when Nazi leadership decided that children were the last resource available to defend Berlin. By late 1944, Germany was collapsing. The Wehrmacht had been shattered on the Eastern Front. The Western Allies had liberated France and were approaching the Rhine. German cities were burning under constant aerial bombardment. Millions of German soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. The Nazi leadership faced a manpower crisis with no solution. On October 18, 1944, Heinrich Himmler announced the creation of the Volkssturm, the People's Storm, a last-ditch militia that would conscript every male between ages 16 and 60 not already in military service. In reality, the age requirements were often ignored. Boys as young as 12 were pressed into service. Some volunteered, products of years of Hitler Youth indoctrination. Others were simply rounded up. The Volkssturm was a military absurdity. Its members received minimal training, sometimes just a few days. They had inadequate weapons, often antiquated rifles from World War I or cheap single-shot Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets. They had no uniforms in many cases, just armbands identifying them as Volkssturm. Under international law, this violated the basic requirements for lawful combatants. But by late 1944, the Nazi regime had abandoned any pretense of following international law. What the Volkssturm did have was fanaticism, especially among the Hitler Youth members. While older conscripts often tried to avoid service or surrendered at the first opportunity, the teenage boys often fought with terrifying dedication. They'd been raised their entire lives believing that dying for Hitler was glorious, that surrender was cowardice, that defeat was impossible if one simply believed hard enough. As Soviet forces approached Berlin in April 1945, these beliefs would be tested in the most horrific way imaginable. The Hitler Youth and Volkssturm were ordered to defend the capital. They were given Panzerfausts, shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons that required getting within 30 meters of a tank to be effective, and told to stop the Soviet advance. It was a death sentence disguised as a military order. Soviet tanks were supported by infantry, artillery, and overwhelming numerical superiority. A child with a Panzerfaust facing a Soviet tank column had virtually no chance of survival, even if they successfully destroyed a tank. But the orders were given, and the children obeyed. April 21st, 1945. Soviet forces reached the outskirts of Berlin. The battle for the German capital would involve over 2.5 million Soviet troops, supported by 6,250 tanks and assault guns against approximately 45,000 Wehrmacht soldiers, 40,000 Volkssturm militia, and somewhere between 2,500 and 5,000 Hitler Youth members. The disparity was absurd. The outcome was never in doubt. But the Hitler Youth fought anyway. Eyewitness accounts from both Soviet soldiers and German civilians describe scenes of horror and tragedy. Boys aged 12 to 16 manning anti-aircraft guns on rooftops, continuing to fire even as Soviet tanks approached. Soviet infantry reported finding the bodies of children still at their gun positions, killed at their posts. Teenagers armed with Panzerfausts hiding in rubble, waiting for Soviet tanks to pass before attempting suicidal attacks. The tactic occasionally worked. A tank would be destroyed, but the child soldier rarely survived. Soviet infantry following the tanks would kill anyone who revealed themselves by firing. One Soviet officer, Vasily Grossman, later wrote in his diary, "We are advancing through a city defended by children. I saw a boy, couldn't have been more than 13, lying dead with a Panzerfaust beside him. His face looked peaceful, almost confused, as if he didn't understand why the glorious victory he'd been promised hadn't come. It's the most disturbing thing I've seen in this entire war, and I've seen Stalingrad." German civilians trapped in the battle described boys in uniforms too large for them, helmets that fell over their eyes carrying weapons they could barely lift, following orders to fight to the death. Some accounts describe children as young as 10 or 11 being given grenades and told to throw themselves under Soviet tanks. Human anti-tank mines. These accounts are difficult to verify with precision. The battle was chaos, documentation was scattered, and both Soviet and German sources have reasons to exaggerate or minimize certain details. But what's undeniable is that children fought and died in significant numbers defending Berlin, and that this was a deliberate choice by Nazi leadership. Hitler himself, in his final weeks, repeatedly referenced the Hitler Youth's fanaticism as evidence that Germany could still win if every citizen showed equal dedication. He decorated child soldiers for destroying Soviet tanks, presenting medals to boys in the Führer bunker while the city burned above him. But the Hitler Youth's role wasn't limited to combat. In the chaos of Berlin's collapse, some Hitler Youth units took on another role: enforcers of loyalty and executioners of defeatism. As Berlin descended into apocalyptic chaos in late April 1945, Nazi authorities faced a growing problem. desertion. Soldiers were abandoning their posts. Civilians were hanging white flags from windows. People were hiding in cellars rather than fighting. To the fanatics still loyal to Hitler, this was treason, punishable by death. Fliegende Standgericht, flying courts-martial, were established. These were mobile execution squads authorized to conduct summary trials and immediate executions for desertion, defeatism, or cowardice. And many of these execution squads were composed of Hitler Youth members. The reasoning was chilling. The boys had been indoctrinated so thoroughly that they still believed in ultimate victory. They were too young to question orders, and they could be trusted to show no mercy to those who failed the test of absolute loyalty. Accounts from survivors describe teenage boys, some as young as 15, conducting trials that consisted of asking a single question: why aren't you fighting? If the answer was unsatisfactory, if the accused admitted fear, spoke of surrender, or questioned the possibility of victory, the sentence was death by hanging. The executions were conducted in public as warnings. Bodies were left hanging from lampposts with signs reading, "I was a coward," or "I betrayed the Führer." One particularly horrifying account describes a 16-year-old Hitler Youth member named Herbert Tege, who was part of a hanging squad in Berlin's final days. Tege later testified during post-war investigations that his squad hanged over 30 people in a 3-day period, including Wehrmacht soldiers found hiding in cellars, Volkssturm members who had removed their armbands, civilians who displayed white flags. One elderly man whose crime was saying the war was lost, Tege claimed he was following orders and believed he was serving Germany. He showed no remorse in his initial testimony, stating that traitors deserved death. Only years later, in old age, did he express understanding of what he'd done. By then, it was too late for his victims. Not all Hitler Youth members participated in these atrocities. Many resisted, deserted, or simply tried to survive. But enough participated that the phenomenon was widespread and systematic. The hanging squads represented the ultimate corruption of childhood by Nazi ideology. Boys who should have been learning mathematics and history instead learned to kill their own countrymen for insufficient enthusiasm. April 30, 1945. Adolf Hitler committed suicide in the Führer bunker. The news was kept secret initially, but it spread through rumor and whisper. The man these children had been raised to worship, to die for, to believe in absolutely, was dead. For the Hitler Youth still fighting, the psychological impact was devastating. Some continued fighting anyway, unable to process the reality that their entire worldview had collapsed. They fought Soviet soldiers street by street, building by building, even as organized resistance crumbled around them. Others simply stopped. Their conditioning broke. Boys who had been firing anti-aircraft guns hours earlier sat in rubble, crying, unable to understand what they were supposed to do now. Some committed suicide. There are documented cases of Hitler Youth members shooting themselves rather than surrender, even after Hitler's death became known, so thoroughly indoctrinated that they couldn't conceive of life in a world without the Führer. On May 2, 1945, the Battle of Berlin officially ended. The remaining German forces surrendered. Soviet soldiers sweeping through the ruins found scenes of surreal horror. Classrooms converted to ammunition depots, school gyms filled with weapons, and the bodies of children in oversized uniforms. The estimates of Hitler Youth casualties in the Battle of Berlin vary widely, from several hundred to several thousand. Precise numbers are impossible because many Hitler Youth members weren't officially registered as military combatants. The chaos of the battle made accurate record-keeping impossible. Some bodies were never identified or were buried in mass graves. Soviet forces didn't always distinguish between child soldiers and adults in their casualty reports. What we know is that hundreds of children who should have been in school died fighting for a regime that valued them only as expendable resources. And in the immediate aftermath, the survivors faced a reckoning. The collapse of Nazi Germany created a psychological crisis for the Hitler Youth generation. These children, now adolescents and young adults, had spent their entire formative years in a system that told them Germany was destined for greatness, Hitler was infallible, dying for the Reich was the highest calling. Victory was inevitable if one simply believed. Now all of that was revealed as lies. Germany was occupied, divided, and devastated. Hitler was dead by his own hand, having abandoned the people he claimed to love. The thousand-year Reich had lasted 12 years and ended in apocalyptic defeat. The psychological adjustment was, for many, impossible. Some former Hitler Youth members spent the rest of their lives in denial, maintaining that Germany could have won if only people had fought harder, if traitors hadn't undermined the effort, if the Führer had lived. Others experienced complete psychological breakdown, unable to reconcile what they'd been taught with observable reality. Many struggled with guilt, especially those who had participated in executions or war crimes. Some committed suicide in the years following the war. Others buried their past and never spoke of it. The Allied occupation authorities faced a dilemma: how to treat child soldiers and those indoctrinated from infancy. The Nuremberg trials established that following orders was not a complete defense for war crimes. But could that standard apply to people who'd been systematically indoctrinated from age 6? The solution was inconsistent. High-ranking Hitler Youth leaders who had organized war crimes or executions were prosecuted. Some received prison sentences, though typically shorter than adult war criminals. Ordinary Hitler Youth members who had simply fought as soldiers were generally not prosecuted. They were considered victims of indoctrination rather than perpetrators. Those who had participated in specific atrocities, like the hanging squads, faced a gray area. Some were prosecuted, especially if there was evidence they'd acted with enthusiasm beyond what orders required. Others avoided justice because proving individual culpability was difficult. The broader question of collective guilt haunted Germany for generations. These children had been raised in a system designed to turn them into fanatics. They'd been subjected to propaganda from their earliest memories. They'd been threatened, pressured, and manipulated. But they'd also made choices. Some had resisted. Some had refused orders. Some had hidden rather than fight. The fact that resistance was possible, even if difficult and dangerous, meant that those who participated bore some degree of moral responsibility. How much responsibility? That question remains contested to this day. The story of the Hitler Youth's final stand reveals multiple layers of moral failure. First, the adult leadership's willingness to sacrifice children. Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, and other Nazi leaders knew by April 1945 that the war was lost. They chose to send children to die anyway, not because it would change the outcome, but because their ideology valued suicidal resistance over rational surrender. Goebbels, in one of his final diary entries, wrote, "The Hitler Youth show what Germany could have been if everyone had their spirit. Their sacrifice will inspire future generations." This was monstrous. These men sentenced children to death and called it inspiration. Second, the system that made child soldiers possible. The Hitler Youth program demonstrated how thoroughly children can be indoctrinated if a state controls education, media, and social organizations from early childhood. These children didn't spontaneously decide to fight Soviet tanks. They were systematically shaped into fanatics over years of conditioning. This raises uncomfortable questions about state power over children, about the limits of parental rights when a regime claims total authority, and about how to prevent similar indoctrination in the future. Third, the children's own agency and responsibility. Even acknowledging the powerful indoctrination, some Hitler Youth members made choices that exceeded what was required. The hanging squads, for instance, often acted with enthusiasm that went beyond following orders. Some boys volunteered for these units. Some showed creativity in finding defeatists to execute. Can we hold them responsible? How much agency do 15-year-olds have? The answer varies by individual circumstance, but it cannot be zero. Responsibility exists on a spectrum, and even deeply indoctrinated individuals retain some capacity for moral choice. Fourth, the selective memory and forgetting. In post-war Germany, the Hitler Youth's final stand became a taboo subject. It was too painful, too complicated, too difficult to process. The children who fought were victims of indoctrination, but also sometimes perpetrators of atrocities. They deserved sympathy, but also accountability. They were manipulated, but also made choices. This complexity made them easier to forget than to remember honestly. The result is that this chapter of the war remains less known than it should be. The image of Nazi Germany is dominated by adult perpetrators, the SS, the Gestapo, the Wehrmacht leadership. The reality that thousands of children fought and died for Nazism, that some of them committed war crimes, that indoctrination can turn children into killers. These truths are more disturbing than adult evil because they challenge our assumptions about childhood innocence. Today, if you walk through Berlin, you'll find memorials to the victims of Nazism. Jews, political prisoners, resistance fighters, civilians killed in bombing raids. You will not find memorials to the Hitler Youth who died defending the city. This absence is intentional. These children were not heroes. They fought for an evil regime. Their deaths did not serve justice or freedom, but they were still children. Children who were raised in a system designed to turn them into fanatics. Children who believed the lies they were told. Children who died for a cause that betrayed them. Their tragedy is that they were both victims and perpetrators simultaneously. Victims of indoctrination, but sometimes perpetrators of atrocity. Some of the Hitler Youth who survived have spent their final years trying to warn new generations about the dangers of indoctrination, nationalism, and following charismatic leaders without question. Others have never spoken about their experiences, carrying guilt and trauma in silence until death. The youngest survivors are now in their 90s. Within a decade, all first-hand witnesses will be gone. What lessons remain? First, children are not naturally resistant to propaganda. With sufficient control over education and culture, a state can shape children into believers of virtually any ideology. Second, indoctrination is not a complete excuse. Even thoroughly indoctrinated individuals retain some moral agency, some capacity for resistance, some responsibility for their choices. Third, using children as soldiers is always a war crime, not just legally, but morally. A society that sends children to fight has already lost its soul, regardless of the battle's outcome. Fourth, the victims of indoctrination can also be its perpetrators. These categories are not mutually exclusive. Moral complexity exists, and refusing to acknowledge it serves no one. Imagine being 12 years old and being handed a rocket launcher, being told that dying while destroying a Soviet tank is the greatest thing you could do with your life. Imagine believing it. Imagine doing it. Imagine being 15 and executing someone for admitting the war is lost, believing you're serving justice, serving Germany, serving honor. Then imagine learning, years later, that everything you believed was a lie, that you killed for nothing, that your fanaticism served only evil. How do you live with that? Some of the Hitler Youth couldn't. Some committed suicide in the decades after the war. Others lived with guilt that never diminished. A few rationalized and denied until death. But all of them paid a price for being born in the wrong place at the wrong time and raised in a system designed to turn children into killers. The 12-year-olds with Panzerfausts, the 15-year-olds conducting executions, the 16-year-olds dying at anti-aircraft guns, they were children. Children who should have been learning, playing, growing up in peace. Instead, they were given weapons and told dying was glory. And some of them believed it. That's the final horror of the Hitler Youth. Not that children were victimized by the Nazi regime, though they were, but that some of them became true believers, willing executioners, fanatics who chose death over surrender. Evil doesn't require monsters, it just requires systems that teach children that cruelty is virtue and dying for lies is honor. If this story disturbed you, challenged you, or made you think about indoctrination, responsibility, and the corruption of innocence, hit that subscribe button. History's darkest lessons come from the stories that make us most uncomfortable. The children who died defending Berlin deserve to be remembered, not as heroes, but as a warning.